The plumber stared at the vents, went white, and told me to pack my things and leave, to never tell my children. I did. What I left behind was meant to be my slow death. If someone you loved betrayed you and you longed for the sweetest justice, hit like, subscribe, and drop your story in the comments. This one will stay with you. My house was a map of memory. Cream walls I'd painted by hand, my mother's floral mug warming my palm each morning, photographs crowding the mantel where my husband's smile still lived. The mornings had been quieter since he died, but routine kept the room steady, until the drip appeared, a dark bloom on the dining ceiling that would expose everything. The cream paint on the walls still smelled faintly of the day I rolled the last coat myself, a soft, stubborn scent that clung to the house like a memory. I cupped my mother's floral mug with both hands, the rim chipped in the same place it had been for as long as I could remember, and watched dust motes drift through a slice of morning light. The photographs on the mantel kept their small, constant smiles. My husband's laugh, frozen in the center, my children younger, somehow kinder in those grainy prints. The house felt honest in the way familiar things do, predictable, safe, lined with a lifetime of ordinary gestures. Adrian came and went in the way of sons who have grown practical. His voice over the phone was flat, efficient. "Don't call the old contractors, Mum. We'll get someone in." Clara had retreated into the smaller rooms of the past, her answers worn thin. "I'm okay, Mum," she'd say, the words so small they could be mistaken for politeness. They both lived here again, for reasons that sounded like love on paper, but left a hollow at the base of my throat. I told myself gratitude filled that hollow. I told myself that caring for them was payment for years of parenting, but sometimes, in the small hours, loneliness threaded through my bones. It arrived like a draft you can't quite locate. The drip began as gossip, a quiet rhythm on the other side of the ceiling that should have been nothing more than plumbing and luck. At first it was dismissible, a small stain swelling where the cream met shadow. When it darkened and spread across the dining room light, I dialed Adrian with fingers that trembled for reasons I told myself were merely age. His clipped reply came like a work order. "I'll handle it. Don't call the original contractors. Use Gabriel. He's reliable." There was an edge I hadn't heard before, a hurriedness that made the words sharp. "Why not them?" I asked, and he deflected it with the sound of someone rearranging plans. "Trust me," he said. "Just don't call them." There was something in that insistence that felt small and strange in my chest, like a tremor under a calm surface. The day the plumber arrived, Clara barely raised her head from the sofa where she spent too much time staring out the window. Her voice, when she spoke, was soft enough to be apology. "It's probably nothing," she said, as if she were convincing herself. I wanted to believe her. I wanted to keep the house calm and the days ordinary. But the drip darkened like a bruise, and a stranger's tools seemed less innocuous than they should. Gabriel knocked with the kind of practiced rhythm that made doors obey. He carried a toolbox worn smooth at the handle, the leather strap at his shoulder smelling faintly of engine oil and the sea. His hands were large and competent, but his eyes were gentler than his palms suggested. They measured the room with a steadiness that made me exhale. He greeted me with a small, respectful smile and that curious, wordless confidence that belongs to people who fix things. "Morning, Mrs. Lawson. Just here to have a look." He spoke like someone who understood domestic spaces, and that understanding warmed me in a way the conversation with my children did not. He crouched beneath the sink, the metal clink of his tools composing a small, intimate music. The concrete underfoot smelled like old homes, a mix of dust, faint mold, and the faintest trace of winter wood smoke. He moved methodically, fingers finding pipes as if they were familiar friends. I told Gabriel about the stain, about how the drip started, about the headaches I'd been dismissing for months. He nodded, notebooks of experience folding behind his eyes, and asked practical questions that sounded more like gentle probes. When did it start? Who was in the house during renovations? Were there any unusual smells? He rose, flashlight cutting a cone of amber across the basement hatch, and said he'd check the vents. Watching him descend felt like watching a man enter the belly of a beast I had never suspected. The stairs swallowed his silhouette and a pocket of cool air spilled into the kitchen. I washed my hands at the sink and felt the skin tighten from soap and nerves. The house suddenly seemed larger, full of unfixed places. When Gabriel returned, his face had changed. There was a blanch to his cheeks that made the kind eyes seem 2 sizes too small, and his hands trembled as he set the toolbox down. He held out a photograph at first, a print of the device tucked into the piping like a tumor, but then he stopped himself and folded his hands. The words came thick. "It's not a leak," he said, the sentence a small avalanche. My stomach folded in on itself. "Not a leak?" I echoed. When we climbed back up the stairs, the light seemed brighter, almost exposing. The kitchen smelled of toast and lemon polish, small domestic details that fought against the enormity of what I had been told. I caught a glimpse of Clara in the living room, her back to us, fingers fidgeting with the hem of her sleeve. She looked up with an expression I could not read, and I felt a strange, cold distancing, as though the air between us had been filled with glass. Gabriel kept his distance, but his voice was steady. "We'll sort this," he said. "But you must go. Now." The imperative had the soft edge of someone who has seen enough to know leniency is dangerous. My legs moved because they must, not because I could make sense of any of it. I closed the front door behind us with a click that sounded impossibly loud, the lock engaging like a finality. Outside, the world smelled ordinary. Car exhaust, the thin green of a neighbor's hedges, the small chaos of a day continuing despite the rupture within my walls. I walked toward Gabriel's van with a bag on my shoulder and a photograph pressed against my chest. The image of family now felt both precious and weaponized. My heart beat in uneven rhythms, part mourning, part furious, part relieved. I did not look back until the van turned the corner and the outline of my house smudged into distance, the cream paint blurring into a memory that would never again feel safe in the same way. Concrete pressed cold into my palms as I descended, the flashlight's beam cutting a narrow tunnel through the basement's dim. The air down there tasted like old coins and dust, a metallic tang that settled on my tongue and made me swallow twice. Dampness clung to the steps. The concrete hummed faintly with the memory of winter. Every household creak sounded larger underground, as if the house itself were breathing in slow, suspicious rhythms. Gabriel moved with workman's economy. No wasted motion, elbows and shoulders accustomed to cramped spaces. His light skimmed across water stains and exposed joists, and for a moment, the basement seemed like any other hidden room in a lived-in home. Boxes labeled in my husband's handwriting, a discarded paint roller, a tangled length of twine. Then his beam found something that did not belong, a neat rectangle of plastic and tubing tucked too deliberately into the ductwork. It gleamed clinical under the flashlight, as if it had been made in someone else's clearer, colder mind. He set his toolbox down carefully and unlatched the device with the same reverence a funeral director might give a small coffin. I felt my stomach tighten as he lifted panels and showed me what I had no right to comprehend. Tubes led into the ventilation like small veins. Little vials sat in a tray, their contents a yellowy, viscous blur. A block with tiny numbered switches and a timer sat like a detached brain. He did not explain mechanically. He cataloged instead, naming things in a way that made them feel less like instructions and more like evidence. Tubing, time switches, reservoirs. His words painted a machine. The image assembled itself in my head without technical detail, only the awful conclusion. I ran my fingers along one of the tubes. It was cool and slightly slick, the plastic smooth like a toy, but with a menacing economy. The sensation was absurdly domestic for such a thing. My fingers, the tubing, my breath, but the normalcy made it worse. It felt like finding a razor in a child's toy chest. I could almost hear my pulse in the silence. Gabriel's voice when he spoke next was low and careful, the exact tone one uses when handing someone a verdict. Not a leak. A machine. For me. Those words fell like a series of small, hard stones ricocheting in the concrete air. Not a leak. A machine. For me. My mouth dried, my mind tried to reach back for reasons: poor ventilation, a misread gauge, an old appliance. But the facts Gabriel showed me folded those options away. He pointed out how the tubing fed directly into the vents above my bedroom, how the device's outputs were angled toward the sleeping areas. He did not describe how such a mechanism could be made to function. He did not have to. The implication was clean and intimate. For months, air had carried more than warmth. Images stacked in my head, mornings when my thoughts had been slow as molasses, afternoons when each movement felt wrapped in cotton, small lapses of memory I'd told myself were the price of age. I remembered misplacing the keys that one winter, standing in the hallway, convinced for a long minute that the door had simply vanished. I remembered the afternoons when I would sit down and the world would tilt and I would sleep longer than intended, and wake with a headache that no tea could soften. I had chalked these things up to grief, to the ordinary corrosion of time. Gabriel's questions were surgical, and they exposed that the timeline was not random. He asked when I had first noticed headaches. I answered, stammering with the smallness of admitting vulnerability. He asked about naps and confusion and the precise timing of the renovation. As he spoke, each question was a flashlight stabbing into a different corner of memory. The date of the bathroom overhaul, the names of the contractors, the occasions when Adrian had seemed particularly watchful. His face remained patient, but his eyes were hunting for pattern. I felt it, like a surgeon's hands on my history, mapping incision points. Why did my children seem robust at the same time? Gabriel's question landed like a punctuation mark. I hadn't thought about it that way. How odd that two younger, healthier people could remain steady while I eroded. Had I assumed the discrepancy a mercy, a natural reshaping of energy? He suggested, gently, that advantage often takes the shape of avoidance. Some bodies resist while others sink. The concrete beneath my feet seemed to tilt. He mentioned dates, how the device components matched the timeline of the upstairs renovation, and the correlation snapped into place with the stubborn clarity of arithmetic. The idea of motive arrived not as accusation, but as a cold, inevitable accounting. Numbers and paper slid into view. The life insurance policy my husband and I had taken out years ago, small print that now looked like a ledger awaiting exploitation. Savings accounts that once seemed to me like quiet anchors. The house itself, built with years of thrift and careful planning, suddenly visible as an asset with a price tag. I felt my stomach roll as if looking over a cliff's edge. The thought that whispered through the basement's low light was not about death, but about calculus. How desperation adds columns of justification in a ledger no one sees until the sums are done. Images of my children's faces flickered across the light. Adrian, with a frown I had misread as concentration. Clara, whose laughter had thinned into excuses. I imagined them at a dining table I could not bear to sit at now, speaking in hushed tones about ways to accelerate an inheritance. The idea felt obscene until I caught myself treating it like a problem to be solved. If someone wanted money, what better way than to weaponize the most intimate environment they could access? The thought made my hands cold. Gabriel's own expression hardened, not in anger, but in the crystalline efficiency of someone who had seen enough to stop assuming innocence. He spoke of records, small logs that the people who build cold plans sometimes keep. Notes about timing, about dosages, about patience. He did not produce a manual. Only the hint of meticulous cruelty, the mental image of a notebook whose pages recorded the slow collapse of a human life, as if it were an experiment. That mental image lit something like fire in my gut, more fierce than fear. The deliberate cruelty of a plan. My mind flitted to practicalities because panic sharpens logistics. How to leave without tipping the balance. Who could I trust with a story that would be called fantastical? Gabriel's voice retreated to a low, simple command. Leave now. He suggested secrecy not to sow deceit, but to protect me. Loud alarms can startle predators and make them hasty. He was not cavalier. He was composed to a degree that made my knees weaker. The urgency in his tone moved thought into action. I moved through the house with a surreal focus. The kitchen seemed both too large and absurdly small. A stage where props had been arranged to perform a betrayal. I took the papers that proved what I owned, the stamped deeds tucked away in a drawer, the insurance policy with its heavy print, bank documents that woke up the bureaucrat in me and made me aware of what was counted. I folded one photograph into my pocket, the one with my husband smiling by the sea, because memory, even weaponized, felt like ballast. Hands that had trembled in the basement now practiced the ordinary choreography of packing. A sweater, a pair of sensible shoes, the little silver locket my mother had given me. As I worked, Gabriel watched the doorway, eyes scanning the room as one might scan a shoreline for signs of dangerous weather. He explained, without excess, that the less my children suspected, the clearer the evidence could become. Secrecy, in this bitter calculus, meant time for law and forensics to find the truth without interference. I swallowed the ethical nausea of hiding from my own kin. Survival, I told myself, had to outrank sentiment while the threat was immediate. The act of slipping documents into a canvas bag felt like disobedience and salvation at once. Each item I chose was an anchor, proof that I existed beyond their narratives, proof that a life had been lived on honest work and cautious saving. The logbook Gabriel had mentioned, if it existed, would be a damning ledger. I imagined the pages, the cramped handwriting, the clinical dates. The thought made bile rise. I stuffed a pen in my pocket as if even the ability to write might become evidence. When the last thing went into the bag, the house seemed to inhale and exhale in a new rhythm. The light in the kitchen felt brighter and crueler, as if ordinary domesticity mocked me. Clara sat in the living room without looking up, the television murmuring a show whose dialogue I no longer heard. Adrian's truck had left tracks in the driveway. His absence was now an accusation of its own. The weight of what I had taken and left coiled in my shoulders, and I felt twice my age with every step. Gabriel moved toward the front door with that same steady economy. His hand hovered over the handle for a second before turning it. A brief hesitation to measure the exactness of departure. The click of the lock sounded disproportionately loud as it engaged, a definitive punctuation. For a slivered half-second I expected someone to call after us, to say my name with the casual tenderness of family. Nothing came. The quiet swallowed our departure like a lid. Outside, the air tasted of ordinary days and the small, ignorant comforts of neighborhood life. Cut grass, engines warming, the neighbor's dog barking down the street. I walked toward Gabriel's van with my bag pressed to my hip, a photograph folded against my chest. The house receded in the van's rear view like a painting being taken out of a gallery and rolled for storage. When the van turned the corner, the cream facade blurred into distance, and the house door closed behind me like a shutter. Fluorescent light pooled in the hotel room like a pale judgment, thin and steady over the cheap carpet. The kettle on the dresser clicked and hissed metal song into the quiet. Steam curled like a small, ordinary surrender. I opened the window and let the air hit my face. Sharp, salted by a strip of ocean I could almost smell. And for the first time since the basement, I drew a breath that felt like a small, honest thing. My hands would not stop moving. They trembled as if some hidden muscle would not relax. The fingers refused to be simple. I dialed numbers with an insistence that felt like prayer and typed texts, as if the act of composing them could reorder fate. Their replies arrived like shifting weather. Adrian's messages were short at first, the kind of Kurt that lives between work and obligation. "Are you okay? Where are you?" He followed with a forced softness. "Don't be dramatic, Mom. Come home." Clara's began tender, pushing care into syntax. "Are you with someone? Do you need anything? Love you." But each response bloomed darker as minutes ticked. Concern sharpened into irritation, and irritation curdled into impatience. The emoticons that had once made messages gentle now felt like smirks. I read them until my eyes blurred. A text from Adrian. "You should have told me. Now I have to sort this." Another, "Stop making things harder," from Clara. "You're being ridiculous. You can't just run away. You're scaring me." Then, "Come back, or we call someone." The last one carried a note I could not place. A threat wrapped in filial duty. The internal catalog in my head began arranging these lines like evidence on a table. Words that had once been comfort now served as instruments of pressure. My mind tried to hold love and calculation side by side and failed. The two did not fit together any longer. The hotel corridor smelled of coffee and disinfectant, a smell that made my skin feel thin. I sat with my bag on my lap and watched people move past, suitcases rolling with indifferent rhythm. A housekeeping trolley squeaked. A couple argued softly outside a door. The world continued its shallow breathing while my own life had been turned inside out. I replayed faces. Adrian's jaw set at family dinners, Clara's laugh cut short, the way they had both declined invitations to help with mundane chores that would have explained access. In my head, happier images arrived like distorted film. Christmas lights, the dog asleep by the hearth, hands passing plates across a table. Each recollection now tasted of something else. An overlay of suspicion that stained joy with doubt. Gabriel returned later than I expected, his work boots scuffing down the corridor like a man carrying more than tools. He set pictures on the small table and slid the phone across so I could see. The images were clinical and spare, close-ups of plastic connectors, a tray of vials caught in the flash, tubing threaded into ducting like something grown rather than installed. He spoke softly as if lowering voices could muffle the horror they described. I documented everything, he said. Photos, angles, serial numbers. If someone's tampered with things, we need to preserve what's left. He described the way certain components bore marks of recent handling, fingerprints in the dust. A tiny smudge of a chemical on a casing that a layperson would not notice but that a trained eye could trace to a more deliberate act. He did not present the device as a how-to. He presented it as a wound, clean edges, deliberate insertion, patient intent. The notion that anyone could plan such cruelty in the rooms I had filled with linens and lullabies made my insides feel like they had been rearranged. While he spoke, I found myself sliding back through scenes I had once thought of as past and gentle. I remembered my daughter pressing her forehead to mine when she was small, the slight damp in her hair from bathwater. I remembered Adrian teaching me how to hang a shelf, cursing softly when his measurement was off. Those images were not erased, but they now shimmered with an extra layer. How easily proximity breeds opportunity. In a flash, my memories rearranged. The kitchen where we had joked now read like a blueprint of access. Gabriel's phone buzzed at one point with a message he ignored in favor of what lay before us. Later, he told me what he had heard when he had gone back. Not just the clink of a tool, but voices. He had not wanted to believe them at first, he said, because hope makes liars out of our worst expectations. Then he had paused outside the kitchen door and listened as two voices conspired with the casual manner of people discussing shopping lists. The words were domestic in tone, but unnatural in content, mentions of money and timing and a plan with the calmness of a recipe. Gabriel repeated snippets he had overheard, and the sound of them sat like a stone in my throat. "We can't wait forever," one voice said. "We need it sorted before the creditors come." Another replied, "Make it look natural. Old age, sickness, something no judge will doubt." Voices that once meant bedtime stories now plotted accounts. I pictured them bent over a table, whispering as if the house itself were a co-conspirator. The tone in Gabriel's voice when he told me these lines was not theatrical, it was stunned. "They spoke like men talking about a parcel," he said. "Like accountants, not children." When he mentioned a plan B, my skin crawled. He gave me the words as if translating from a language that leaves no room for misinterpretation. Quick, undetectable, an accident. He described how impatience turns cruelty faster when patience expires. Desperate people invent immediacy. He did not cloak these facts in melodrama. He stated them the way a mechanic describes a seized engine, matter-of-fact and fatalistic. They discussed an acceleration of the schedule, he said, a syringe, a fall, anything that could be pinned on chance. Those specifics reframed my fear into a different animal. Imminent danger. The abstract terror of being slowly unwell was horrifying, but the prospect of a planned, rapid act made the air around me electric. I imagined the syringe as a small, terrible instrument, a thing that could be hidden in a hug, coiled in the sleeve of a visit, or slipped into tea. My brain resisted the image while also lodging it deeply, a splinter that throbbed in the background of every movement. Gabriel produced pictures of a small notebook, the kind used by tradesmen and planners, darkened edges, handwriting precise and economical. He said he had found notes, dates, and small shorthand entries, times, amounts, observations. He did not show me incriminating passages so much as the existence of inventory, a ledger that implied research, testing, patience. The presence of a logbook suggested a mind that had framed suffering as data. The coldness of that realization made my muscles go numb. I sat there in the corridor and let the images slide across me while trying to keep a breath steady. My hands smoothed over the bedspread because movement steadied me. Flashbacks arrived in sharp shards. Clara's small triumph the night she finished a course, Adrian's quiet pride the day he completed a job. Each recollection now bore the overlay of betrayal's possibility. I tried to remember the texture of their palms, the heat of their cheeks, and my chest contracted at the duplicity those ordinary details could now conceal. The calls and messages continued. Adrian moved from curt to demanding, "Where are you? You need to come home and sort this with me." He wrote later, "Don't make this harder." Clara's tone turned thinner. "This is going to ruin everything. Come back and explain yourself." The pleas felt weaponized. They pushed me toward action that would place me back under the roof where the danger had been laid. They asked for control I could not give without risking everything. Gabriel insisted on keeping the photographs and his notes safe. He argued with a restraint that masked a deeper urgency that the fewer people who knew, the cleaner the trail of evidence would be. Forensics needed uncontaminated scenes. Police needed a narrative they could build. He spoke of chain of custody and the way stories can be smothered by familial counter-narratives if they are allowed to find their own explanations first. The suggestion to maintain secrecy felt like a betrayal of the family code, but the alternative, alerting them, felt like handing the map to those who had drawn the route. When he finally placed the phone with the images in my hands, the photos made things irrevocable. The tiny scuffs, the fingerprints, the insertion points, all of it suggested a mind that had spent time thinking about how to hide harm in the commonplace. The logbook's existence turned suspicion into a paper trail. The arithmetic of motive, debts, the weight of obligations that can make children into strangers, settled inside me like a verdict. My stomach lurched, metallic and cold. I tasted old pennies and hot fear. I felt the room spin a small private circle as the implications stacked. For a moment, the world reduced to three things: the photographs, the logbook, the sound of my own pulse. Then, somewhere outside, as if coaxed by the same dread that had pushed us into motion, I imagined a sound. Distant at first, and then shaping into something I had not wanted to hear. A wail that cut through the ordinary noise, a hint of blue and red and motion on a street. The siren seemed to arrive before any action had been taken, as if the city itself had been waiting for this turn. Their car rolled up the drive like an announcement, gravel scattering in small, tidy arcs. They stepped out with the composure of people who had practiced concern in front of mirrors. Adrian, with a brow drawn into an expression that suggested worry without admitting anything sharper. Clara, smoothing the sleeve of her coat as if arranging sympathy by hand. Their faces were designed to settle the room, mouths curved in rehearsed softness, eyes that flicked past details rather than land where they might be questioned. They moved toward me with the easy cadence of those who assume a scene will play out on their cue. They hugged me in turns, quick, practiced embraces that smelled faintly of aftershave and the salon. Adrian's hand was steady on my shoulder. "Where did you go?" he asked, like someone filling in a form. Clara's voice was syrup thin. "We were so worried. Are you all right?" The lines fell like varnish over their intent, slick, glossy, protective. I watched their micro-expressions the way one watches ripples on water, a twitch of a lip, a held breath, a hand that lingered too long on the small of my back. My senses tuned to the wrongness behind the wrongness. Every tick of the clock felt like a seam being inspected. They did not ask blunt questions. They did better than that. They offered small, blunt commands wrapped in love. Come home, Adrian said. We'll sort this. He sounded practical. Clara leaned closer and lowered her voice to an intimacy that felt like a trap. You're frightened. Let us take care of you. Short sentences, shorter still. Everything will be fine. I could sense the pressure mounting in the space between their words. Their affection folded itself around an expectation that I would return to the house, to the oven warm with dinner, to the refuge that had been betrayed. I answered with calm I did not always feel. My voice measured returned the air between us to level terms. I'm staying put, I said. Not yet. My refusal was a small, firm stone. It threw the water into a new pattern. Adrian's eyes narrowed for the briefest flash. Clara's fingers found the hem of her coat and twisted. The manipulation tightened. You're making this harder, Adrian said. Short, sharp. You don't understand what this does to us. His words implied a cost I could not pay. He framed my caution as selfishness, a disruption of their plans. Clara's tone shifted. The sweetness drained away like color from a photograph. You're seeing threats where none exist, she said. Maybe you're not thinking straight. Short sentences, sharper. Doubt became a weapon. I felt their strategy like a tide encircling me. Isolate, discredit, return. They set the net with practiced hands. I held my ground and breathed. There was a steadiness in not giving them the immediate panic they wanted to reflect back. I spoke slowly, each phrase deliberate. I have proof, I said. I've seen something. I'm not safe. My words were not dramatic. They were factual. My heart felt a hammering behind the ribs, but my voice remained even. They exchanged a glance that was fleeting and contained more than 1,000 reassurances. In the stead of warmth, I read calculation. Adrian's response was softer this time, as if gentleness could realign the argument. You're scaring us, he said, which felt as if he meant it to be sympathy and a rebuke at once. Come home, and let us help. The plea carried the weight of a man trying to steer a boat back to harbor. Clara placed a hand on my arm. You're upset. We'll take you home. You'll be fine with us. Her palm was cool. The contact, intended to comfort, felt like the closing of a trap. I saw it, the tilt in the way they framed the world. I saw how their sentences narrowed choices, how love could be folded into coercion. I kept my own voice small and precise. I'd rather have the police look at it first, I said. I don't trust anyone yet. The words landed, and the room shifted with them. Adrian's jaw tightened. Clara's face went blank for the blink of an instant. The police? Adrian repeated. Disbelief edged like a blade. You'll make things worse. You don't know what you're saying. Shorter commands followed, each designed to undercut. Come home now. Stop this. You'll panic. The cadence was mechanical. They tried to paint my caution as crisis, not reason. I imagined the house as an instrument being tuned by hands that knew exactly which note to press to make a body comply. I felt the pressure like a physical thing at my collar. We left the hotel and walked down a narrow, slick alley because Clara insisted on a shortcut. She said it would be quicker, that the rain would not reach us there. The sky had been weeping. The stones of the alley shone with the sheen of recent showers. Rain smelled green on the pavement, sharp and mineral, carrying the tang of wet smoke from somewhere distant. A streetlight pooled its yellow into a length of wet asphalt. It was there, in that contracted corridor, that the plot's next scene broke. Clara moved like a woman possessed by performance, her steps quickening. She came at me with a speed that contradicted her earlier softness. Her hand flashed. For a moment, everything slowed to a crawl, and the world came at me in frames. The way her sleeve slid up, the metallic glint at the corner of her grip, the tremor in her wrist. She lunged with something small and bright. Slow motion let me map each small betrayal, the creak of leather, the catch of breath, the way rain threaded its way through her hair and sent droplets across the glint of steel. The syringe looked absurdly ordinary in that desperate moment, compact, clinical, almost innocuous until its intent uncoiled. My eyes registered the tiny needle tip, the bead of fluid clinging to it like a glistening lie. The smell of rain filled the small space between us, and mixed with it was that coppery undertone that fear brings to a mouth. Clara's face was a contortion of resolve and panic. Her knuckles whitened. For an instant, the urge to believe fought the evidence. Then, reflex took over. Adrian's movement was not simple. He did not tackle. He intervened with the complicated choreography of someone who knew exactly where to strike to produce a specific result. He grabbed at the camera Gabriel had left behind, the little device that could prove everything. He turned. A swift motion to disrupt the chain of proof, and in the same swing his hand struck the syringe from Clara's grasp. The small instrument skittered across the wet cobble and came to rest, watched by 3 pairs of eyes that could not unsee it. For a terrifying breath there was a tangle. Clara bent for the syringe. Adrian stamped toward it. I recoiled. The world speeded and then stalled. A foot slipped on the slick stone. The syringe, caught between intention and accident, rolled under a grate where it would have been difficult to retrieve cleanly. The movement felt choreographed, part panic, part attempt at plausible deniability. The sound of boots suddenly changed the texture of the alley, hard, purposeful, breaking into the rhythm of the scene. My heart pounded against my ribs like a trapped animal. Adrenaline clarified my senses. I tasted grit on my tongue, felt the sharpness of rain on my cheeks, heard the distant blare of lights approaching. The concrete under my fingernails had the taste of iron. My palms left smudges on my sleeves as I reached for proof that had been almost stolen. Blue and red smeared the air before the officers' boots found the alley. Their torches carved white beams into dripping darkness. Faces became halogen and shadow. The lights painted everyone with a sharp, false clarity. The wet hair, the wet coats, the syringe under the grate, the camera smashed against a rubbish bin where Adrian had flung it in a reflex that read like a confession. The officers' voices were authority itself, clipped and clean. Hands where we can see them. Step back. The language was designed to disentangle chaos with procedure. When the forensics team arrived, they moved with the solemnity of museum conservators. Their gloved fingers probed the edges of the scene, finding what my panic had missed. They traced a faint, oily residue in the gutter where the syringe had rolled. They pried up a small section of grate and found the instrument's tip lodged in mud. The sterility compromised by rain and grit, but still telling if the right tests were done. One technician crouched to photograph prints on a wet patio stone. The sheen of a fingerprint showed up under the angle of the light, like a ghost. Another swabbed the edge of a duct that Adrian had brushed against, collecting strands of hair and a smudge of chemical the lab reported later as suspicious. Gabriel's camera lay in pieces where Adrian had smashed it, the lens shattered like a small star. He looked at the ruin and tilted his head, a private grief for evidence lost. They tried to erase the trail, he muttered, voice rough. But the forensics found other things. A notebook with shorthand, traces of an oily residue in a vent shaft, timestamps on photographs that matched the renovation schedule. Small things accumulated into a pattern the way raindrops gather into a storm. The officers moved with a practiced rhythm, measured and official. They read rights in that precise cadence that seems to take life's particulars and fold them into a script. You have the right to remain silent. My children's faces did not register shock or contrition when the handcuffs clicked. Their expressions were blank, as if the soap of their practiced sympathy had been stripped away by something harder and colder. Adrian's jaw worked, but no sound came. Clara's eyes were dry and glassy. She did not weep. The sight of them in cuffs felt like an act of theater gone wrong, the actors revealed without their masks. Inside me, grief was a removed thing, surgical and clean. It was not the wail I had anticipated. Instead, there was a hollow where the sound should have been, a blank that thinned me to bone. The great, messy catalog of affection rewired itself into evidence and betrayal. Each memory narrowed to a single vertical line of light. I felt bereft, not of their presence, but of the possibility that their kindness had ever been genuine. An officer asked me a few procedural questions, name, addresses, the small factual things that anchor a report. My voice said the words while my mind rearranged like plates on a shelf in a quake. Someone covered me with a blanket because the rain had seeped into my clothes and the fabric smelled of shelter and strangers. Gabriel stood close, his hand a steady pressure at the small of my back. In that pressure was the fact of another person's loyalty, an unadorned, practical devotion that cost him no theater and demanded no performance. They led my children away, their steps measured, echoing down a corridor that had smelled, for decades, of home. The flash of police lights receded into the night as the officers drove them past. I watched the taillights of the patrol car cut a red line into the wet road until they were merely a memory. My feet crumpled in my shoes. The alley felt suddenly overlarge and empty. I stood for a long moment under the drizzle and felt every small thing, the roughness of my palms, the damp of the coat around my shoulders, the slow cooling of my breath into the night. The city murmured on, distant engines, a dog barking, the regular thud of life continuing while mine had been rearranged irrevocably. In my head, the images stacked into a final frame. The house returned to me as a severed shape. Its stoop, the porch light left on, the quiet of its rooms. The scene held like a photograph suspended in glass, the house's front steps empty and echoing. The courtroom smelled of paper and a faint hospital clean tang, the sort of air that makes every whisper feel permanent. I sat behind the glass with my hands folded in my lap, the motion a small mechanical ritual to keep myself from fidgeting. A pen scratched somewhere near me, an impatient cursor marking the slow progress of something that did not want to be hurried. Light filtered through high windows and laid thin, judge-colored bands across the floor. I could hear the scrape of shoes, the click of a recorder catching words that would become law. Forensics presented their work like a careful, unblinking witness. A technician spoke of residue tests, swabs taken from vent shafts that picked up chemical traces with peculiar signatures, lab chromatographs that mapped compounds into neat peaks and valleys, each spike a voice confirming presence. They explained how samples from the vent matched the compounds found in the small vials Gabrielle had photographed, how minute traces of the material appeared on a section of ducting that had been accessed during the renovation. A photograph of a logbook lay on a table under a glass case, neat cursive entries, dates aligning to renovation milestones, shorthand notes on dosage and timing. Timestamps on the metadata of photos Gabriel had taken matched the dates the prosecution laid out. The chain of custody was tightened into a ribbon of certainty. Who touched what, when it was bagged, where it was stored. Each detail was a stone in a wall being built. Sitting there, I felt like part of a carefully paced film. My pulse synced with the procedural cadence of experts describing lab processes that had once been foreign to me. The forensic chemist, calm and precise, explained gas chromatograph. Mass spectrometry results like a litany, retention times, molecular fragments, ion ratios. The courtroom listened. I listened. I tried to hold each technical word without panic coiling beneath them, translating the data into a human map of what had been done to me. The screen showed overlays, a map of airflow, arrows tracing the tube's path from basement to my bedroom vents, a slow-motion diagram of diffusion. It was almost elegant in its cruelty, the way science could render malice as method. The prosecutor spoke next, and she spoke like someone who had folded a complex truth into a single, unassailable narrative. "This was planned," she said, voice even, unadorned. "Not an accident, not negligence, a patient, deliberate scheme to render a vulnerable woman unwell to secure financial gain." She laid out the timeline, renovation dates, the installation windows, the onset of symptoms, and then the motive. Debts, a ledger of desperation, that logbook with shorthand entries. She held up the phone photographs and let the images carry their own accusation. The courtroom seemed to lean forward as if to hear the facts more clearly. The defense moved like a countercurrent. Their work was nimble, seeking cracks and alternative light. They argued that the symptoms could be attributed to age or grief, that the lab results might be contaminated, that fingerprints could be planted, and that the timeline was circumstantial. A lawyer's voice rose and fell as he carved rhetorical corridors through the prosecution's narrative. "Is it beyond reasonable doubt that my clients intended harm? Can we exclude every other cause? He invited the court to imagine benign explanations and wrap them in the language of doubt. The questions were clinical, the tone measured, and for a moment I felt the old familiar ache of vulnerability return. The possibility that my own memory might be painted as unreliable. At times, the exchanges resembled a chess match. Why would two siblings perpetrate this? One juror might have asked, though jurors rarely vocalize in court. The prosecutor answered with the plain arithmetic of motive. Desperation can recast kinship as commodity, she said, but motive alone is not enough without method and opportunity. Here we have all three. She punctuated the claim with the logbook's entries, the traces of chemicals, and the smashed camera whose missing data had been partially recovered by digital forensics. The defense countered by questioning chain of custody details, by suggesting contamination or misinterpretation, by pointing at the emotional rawness of family and asking whether grief could color perception. I followed each exchange and felt a small private language forming inside my head. The catalog of my months, headaches in the afternoon that made reading difficult, the fog that settled in like a slow tide, the gentle misplacements of domestic objects that had once comforted me as signs of time and now felt sinister. I heard my own rhythm measured against cold evidence and felt surprisingly composed, as if the facts themselves had offered me a strange consolation, that I had been right to notice that I had not imagined the catalog of small betrayals. Witnesses came and went. Gabriel's testimony was a steady current. He described the device and how he had found it with the same plain, unflinching detail he'd shown me in that basement. He spoke about the photographs, the dates, the quickness with which he had acted to protect me. When asked about the step he'd taken to photograph and then leave to call authorities, his voice tightened only briefly. I thought, if I yelled, if I confronted them, evidence could be destroyed, he said. I wanted something left that couldn't be easily dismissed. His words landed with a kind of practical heroism that made my vision blur. Not from tears, but from pure, exhausted relief. There were difficult moments, cross-examinations meant to unsettle. Defense counsel tried to paint Gabriel's interventions as overreaching, as a man who might have misread a technical problem as malice. He suggested the possibility of misinterpretation and asked about prior disputes, financial disputes, family friction that might color memories. He asked me about arguments that might have occurred, threatening to frame domestic conflict as motive. Each question scraped against an emotional scab, but the evidence, a logbook with dates matching symptoms, lab reports with chemical signatures and vents, photographs, and crucially, the presence of fingerprints and smudges, kept their counterclaims from forming a coherent alternative. When the trial moved into closing arguments, the prosecutor's voice changed gear. She narrowed the large set of facts into a single human frame. This is not merely about money. It's about betrayal. It's about the exploitation of trust. The defendants had the means and opportunity, and they left a paper trail in their haste and habit. Her words were not theatrical. They were wrenchingly ordinary, and in that ordinariness, devastating. The defense's closing was softer, inviting empathy, painting a picture of children crushed by financial pressure, asking for mercy. The contrast between the prosecutor's insistence on accountability and the defense's plea for context made me feel like a fulcrum between two moral logics. The sentence, when it came, landed like weather. The judge's gavel knocked through the room with a sound that had no echo, final, administratively exact. Adrian received 25 years, Clara 20. Their faces did not display the cinematic remorse I'd imagined in the quieter hours of my dread. Instead, a kind of stunned blankness sat across them. Adrian's eyes seemed to look at a point in the room that had nothing to do with me. Clara's lips tightened, as if she were holding back an explanation that would never be given. I felt a strange mixture of vindication and emptiness, the legal confirmation of what my gut had known and the terrible cost of having my family's name spoken as criminals in a forest of strangers. Satisfaction, when it arrived, was thin and complicated. It was not a triumphant exhale, but a heavy, slow settling, like the closing of a wound. I thought of the hours of fear and the quiet days of disbelief, the ways in which trust had been incrementally eroded until only the crust remained. The sentence meant safety in a practical sense. It also meant the irrevocable rewriting of memories. Faces that had once held lullabies now belonged to cells and registries. Grief arrived layered with a strange relief. I could sleep without the sense of chemical fog pressing down. But sleep carried its own ghosts. Packing the house was an act of measured violence against memory. The floorboards complained in the old way as I hefted boxes, and the creak of each step felt like evidence of a life lived honestly until it was not. I wrapped delicate things in tissue and found myself swallowing memories with each fold. The floral teacup, its chipped rim, the photograph of my husband by the sea, the crocheted blanket that had been a gift from a neighbor. The bedroom vents I checked one last time, fingers tracing cool metal that had once been harmless, now redolent with proof. I left the vents closed, their grills unscrewed and bagged by the movers according to instruction, a small, practical echo of finality. Standing on the porch on the last day, the house looked, as it had always tried to, familiar and ordinary. It was a trap in prettiness now, and its cream paint seemed less like warmth than camouflage. I imagined the seasons it had witnessed, the way the sun cut across the dining room in summer, the storm that had broken a window frame 10 years ago, the small party we had held when my husband retired. All those scenes rewound and then reprojected with new color grading, the malice threaded through ordinary patterns like a mean seam. I locked the door with a deliberate hand and felt the sound of latch and key like the closing of a book. We drove away with the boxes packed tight and the last rooms emptied, the house shrinking in the rear view until its edges blurred. The ocean had been a thought for months, a remedy I had spoken of in restless nights as if naming the shore could conjure it into being. The coast promised air that moved and could not be manipulated, salt that scoured memory, gull cries that allowed room for small miracles. I found a small cottage on a street that smelled of kelp and distant engines. The town was stitched with fishermen and cafes, and the wind there meant nothing could sit long enough to settle into rot. The first breath of sea air felt like an apology the world made on my behalf. Salt stung my nostrils with a clean, bracing honesty. The gulls made a racket that felt like laughter after a long, heavy silence. I sat on a bench near my new window and let wind press against my face, letting it rearrange my thoughts. The light was different, brighter but not harsh, and it coaxed a steadier rhythm back into my chest. Gabriel came sometimes. He was a constant without spectacle. He did not demand pride or proximity. He brought over a thermos of coffee and sat on the step while we watched waves fold and unroll. His presence was a quiet kind of loyalty that required no proclamation. He would say little, ask how I slept, whether I had called the insurance people, but in his eyes there was a warmth that felt like rescue, uncomplicated and human. We spoke of small things, the price of milk, a neighbor's stray cat, the way light caught the harbor at dusk. Those conversations rebuilt trust in increments, the small acts of ordinary care slowly stacking like new bricks. I learned to measure people by action again. The old tests, shared bloodlines, familiar endearments, no longer sufficed as guarantees. A man who brings you coffee without waiting for a story, who holds the handle while you step into a new life, is someone whose loyalty is written in deeds rather than declarations. I also learned that justice is not always comfortable. It is clinical, it takes time. It can leave hollow places even as it heals other wounds. The house sold. Strangers now walk its rooms where my laughter and my fear once echoed. The proceeds allowed me a modest cushion and the sense that I had not been entirely erased. I kept the teacup and the photograph of my husband. They live on a small shelf by the window where the light is kind. When I touch the chipped rim, I do so with a hand that remembers both loss and the capacity to choose life. Sometimes, standing on the sand at dusk, I let my feet sink into cool, wet grain and think about how fragile our assumptions of safety can be. Betrayal is a teacher with cruel lessons, but it also sharpened my understanding of what matters. There is dignity in survival, and there is a strange, necessary beauty in the truth finally being heard. I breathe in, taste salt and possibility, and there is for the first time in a long while, room to imagine the future as mine. As betrayal taught me a new definition of family. Blood does not equal loyalty, and survival sometimes asks you to reorder everything you thought sacred. The courtroom delivered a cold, necessary reckoning, procedural and painful, and with that verdict came a strange permission to grieve, to be angry, and to begin again. Healing has been slow and honest. I measure people now by what they do, not by the names they carry. If this saga gave you that rush of justice, subscribe for more true revenge stories and share your own below. Click the next video for another tale.